So I'm going to start with a little bad news. Another iceberg the size of Delaware broke off the Antarctic Peninsula in the last few days. So it's just one more big result of millions of tiny little actions. Tiny, tiny, tiny little actions, and maybe not so tiny in some cases, but the cumulative effect of humans jumping in our cars and driving off many, many times to the store, or, burning coal into the environment, all the things that bring carbon into the world, if you believe the science, are contributing to that in our environment. So, we have many things around us that really demonstrate on a very physical level the law of cause and result, and the dependent arising nature of things. That what we do matters, what we do affects the environment. That said, and I really, for me, really, this is kind of the most important part of my practice these days, is to try to hold this in mind in terms of my relationships with people, how I spend my time, trying to keep track of what I even do with my mind, with that thought in mind. At the same time, on the 4th of July, I happened to read The Guardian, which is a UK newspaper, which has a different perspective on the news sometimes. And there was an editorial in there that I've really been thinking about a lot that I wanted to share with people. It's by a guy named Zachary Karabell, who has, degrees from Oxford and Harvard, and he's an economist and also a statistician, and has written a book about, it's called The Leading Indicators, a short history of the numbers that rule our world. And so his whole perspective is on looking at the numbers of things, looking at statistics as a picture of what's happening in our planet. And he begins his 4th of July editorial saying that, the title is, Americans are in no celebratory mood this 4th of July, but they should be. He says, 240 years since the signing of the Declaration of the Independence, Americans, according to most polls, 60% of the country believes that America is on the wrong track. That number is slightly higher among Republicans. And it said the sour mood is not a product of the Trump administration. The last time the majority believed the country was headed in the right direction was shortly after the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003. So this shows what, as statistically speaking, what we think is important. So that's one thing of concern. But his whole point was not about that. His whole point was not just in the United States, but in countries all around the world. He said almost any place that they've surveyed, less than 40% of the people feel that their country or the world is headed in the right direction. Yet, he said what remains remarkable about the outbreak of global pessimism, anger, and despair is how at odds those sentiments are with certain unequivocal material realities. And then he goes on to cite, never before have so many people on the planet been so well fed, lived so long, been decently housed, lived in governments that they could participate in, and had so little to fear from random or state-sanctioned acts of violence. So this is shocking for us, right? This is not what we read in the news every day. That's why I think this is so important for us to think about. Every part of the world has seen an increase in calorie consumption since 1960. Not just here. Every part of the world, with all the concomitant benefits in health and longevity. Increasingly, people face more health challenges from obesity than from malnutrition around the world. Now, it's true that there are places where there is great, it's true that there are places where there is still great famine. But as countries developed around the world, that's the general statistic. Every part of the world has seen vastly reduced early death. not just from disease, but also from, not just from starvation, but also from disease and from war. For all the attention to the parts of the world where violence and state disintegration are endemic, there are in fact fewer deaths from war and violent conflict than there were throughout most of the 20th century. There are longer lives thanks to medical innovation. There is increased literacy and levels of education, which usually correlates to higher incomes. There is increased participation for women in the workforce. The inequalities of pay still exist, but the education is better. In the US, most Americans spend less on life's essentials than their parents and grandparents did. They're getting more for their dollar. For example, in 30 years ago, no, right after the Second World War, 60 years ago, the size of a home was 750 square feet, normal, average. Today, 3,000 square feet. But percentage of housing, money spent on housing, about the same. Percentage of income spent on food has gone from nearly 25% in 1930 to under 10% today. Percentage. It's not to say. So he says there's an interesting phenomenon in this resetting of expectations. So there's an old saying in the financial world that people always remember the most they made and the least they spent. Which is, he said, that it's like your grandparents going tisk, tisk, tisks, when they say something used to cost 10 cents. But what they don't recall is that the average salary at that time was $2,000 a year. So our expectations kind of get distorted. So this is so interesting to me. As human life has expanded, homes have gotten larger, calories cheaper, wars less frequent, senseless death more rare, political injustice more the exception than the norm. People have become also less tolerant of that which they used to tolerate in terms of difficulties, suffering, and so forth, which, he says, takes us to the news, which has become a daily focus on what is broken, not on what is working. Now, we've lamented that here, we lamented that in our lives, we lamented that, but the thing, he said, it does not make it wrong that the news does what it does, but it sure makes our picture distorted. And when our picture is distorted, what does that do to our mind? And when our mind is distorted, what does that do to the choices that we make? And when we're making our choices out of a place of despair, instead of out of a place that's kind of reasonably balanced or even has some hope or some optimism, then, we can drop into this place where who cares? So I've driven to the store 10 times today. Big ice shelf just fell off yesterday. What difference does that make? Right? So it leads us into a place, I think, can easily lead us to a place where we don't care, or where we feel like everything that we've done is in vain, or somehow there's no immediate evident proof that our good intentions or our wishes for the well-beings of others can be achieved. Or even that our own enlightenment is possible. I mean, the whole thing feeds itself. So I wanted to bring this to our attention. He doesn't cite all his sources. I mean, he's an economist. After I looked up his background, I thought, well, I know he has them. I know you can probably find these numbers somewhere. But it just made me so aware of how easily I'm seduced by watching the news, or what's happening in the news today, and how I have to work with my mind to stay positive and believe that what I do in a virtuous or optimistic way, a beneficial way, matters. And I think it is suicide for us to doubt that for a second. It's so important to continue to do our meditations on, if we have some confidence in what the Buddha taught, if we cultivate some conviction, then we don't need any statistical proof that says what we do matters, whether what we do, whether what we're doing is virtuous and we set our mind in a direction that is beneficial to ourselves and with that motivation to be of benefit of others has an effect, or whether we don't let that mind arise, whether we get careless or despondent or depressed or angry, and the actions that we do under that influence of that mind also matter. They also have an effect. They have an effect immediately on the people around us. They have an effect in the larger material world, small though it may be. And they have an effect on the seeds that we're putting on our own mind stream for our future lives. So I'm appreciating Zachary Karabell for kind of shaking me up a little bit and giving me a much broader global perspective. It's not, there's plenty to do. I'm not saying that the picture is rosy, clearly. You know, and somebody cited, I think Venerable something said yesterday that Stephen Forbes said, it's stupid to care about what's going to happen in 50 years. It's odd to care about what's going to happen in 50 years. That's depressing. But just because Steve Forbes thinks that, so what? His mind can be changed. Our actions can make a difference. And we must rely on our teacher, the Buddha, and believe that that's so. And in that way, our own minds are more at ease, they're more at peace, and we can really walk our talk, walk our conviction, and be of benefit. So I wanted to share this with you. You can look it up. It's in The Guardian, July 4th.